You're listening to the Anxious Scholar Podcast, a podcast for anxious scholars. If you're a high school student who can't wait to go to university, but also is kind of overwhelmed with lots of unanswered questions like me, then you've definitely come to the right place. On this podcast, I sit down with EGM alumni while they share valuable advice from this exciting journey of theirs that we have yet to take. I really hope you'll enjoy this episode and learn lots of useful information about the college application process, unis, and higher education in general. Hello, Isadora. Thank you for agreeing to this interview and welcoming here in Oxford in your UNIF college. I'm really excited for this interview as you have quite an unusual profile and were accepted at Oxford at the ripe age of 15. I can only imagine when you started preparing for the BMAT exam, which we'll talk about later, and your interviews at such a young age. So we'll talk about your journey, how you got here. We'll discuss, of course, your time at our school, École Biomedical, your academic and extracurricular achievements there, your admission process, your gap year, as well as some of your views on life. So before we start, I was wondering if you could say a few words about yourself and your background.
I'm Isadora, I'm 17. I was born and raised in Paris, but my dad is from Italy, my mom's from Malaysia. I graduated from EGM in 2022, and I'm currently a first-year student of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Oxford.
Well, thank you for this introduction. First, to talk about your time at École Biomedical and your baccalaureate. So you chose the IB, the International Baccalaureate, whereas you could have chosen the French International Baccalaureate, which is a little bit different. Could you tell us what made you want to choose the IB and what higher levels and standard levels you chose?
So I chose the IB mainly because they have a stronger emphasis on science than the BFE. Quite simply put, if you do, at least we did OIB, so it was slightly different. I'm not sure whether it's the same. But if you did your SPE, you would have, say, for instance, 4 hours a week of physics chimie, whereas I had 6 hours of straight chemistry every week for 2 years, which means that you go into a lot more depth. And that's the same with, some people did physics. I didn't do physics. I did maths, biology, and chemistry at higher level. And then I did economics, French literature, and English literature at standard level. So the strong emphasis on science was one very important consideration because I already knew I was going to apply for STEM. And then secondly was the fact that it does have a reputation for preparing you for university. It's also well recognized internationally. It's an English program, so it gets you into that Anglo-Saxon way of thinking. I knew I was probably not going to stay in France. The French baccalaureate has got a very French way of doing things, and it just wasn't really going to suit me that well.
And I've heard that they prepare you, for example, for research papers, and that works you do more in like Anglo-Saxon universities as well. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how it's like 6 hours. It's 6 hours only for sciences, or also 6 hours biology, 6 hour chemistry, and 6 hour math.
Yes, for your high levels it's 6 hours per week, and then for your standard levels it's 4 hours a week. So it means that you've got a lot. I had a lot of maths, a lot of biology, a lot of chemistry, pretty much.
And since when did you know you wanted to do these subjects or study sciences, like you mentioned?
Okay, so I've always been very, very STEM-oriented. I dropped history the first chance I had. And the question was, will I do chemistry and physics or chemistry and biology? Because you can't do all three in IB, or at least not in our school. And what happened was I initially was leaning towards chemistry and physics, but second, I did physics, and I wasn't really enjoying physics classes. And then the pandemic hit, and my interest in biology kind of grew from there. And so that cemented, I switched, I originally put in my form chemistry and physics, and then I switched that in second to chemistry and biology.
And in all of these higher levels, you've gotten a 7 out of 7. Mm-hmm. Your average was 38 out of 40, and your final grade 42 out of 45. So you had perfect grades in high school. What do you think helped you manage to achieve this?
I saw that in the questions, that you put perfect grades. I left that there because I think it's important to kind of deconstruct that. It's so far from the truth. It is really, really very far from the truth. In my first term in première, in the IB, my first grade in maths was a 3 out of 7. My first grade in English was a 3 out of 7. These are two subjects which I had an average of 18 out of 20 in second, so it just hit me really, really quite hard. It was a big, steep kind of drop down. My first average for the bulletin was a 32 out of 42, I think, which was below average for the first time in my life. I was suddenly like, oh my God, this is not great.
You said 42 out of 42?
32.
32.
Yeah, that would have been above average for sure. And so the fact that it was such a low grade, kind of like gave me a big shock. I was like, oh, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And then it's not that it's a bad grade per se, but it's just because I was aiming for top institutions, top universities, I knew that it just was not going to cut it. So that kind of, I progressed throughout première. I ended up kind of working hard, got better grades in the second term, in the third term. By the end of première, my average was a 37 out of 42, and that's kind of what they based their predicted grades from, which is why I ended up with probably some good predicted grades, which got me here. We never found out what my predicted grades are. I don't think Bunch tells us what the numbers are, but they were good enough for this. Probably because 37 out of 42 is good enough that if I had enough bonus points, then I would have made it through. And then secondly, there was a strong kind of improvement curve, and my teachers could attest to that. And then Terminal happened, and then that just kind of got worse again, because in Terminal is when you have your extended essay and your internal assessments, which essentially are these long kind of research papers that you mentioned. I ran into a lot of difficulty with my extended essay. To give you an idea, the official submission to EJM was on I think mid-November. I submitted it in March of Terminal because I was just so behind schedule. IAs were an absolute disaster as well. I was scrambling, and essentially once my predicted grades were in, I knew that my bulletins didn't really matter anymore, and so I dedicated all my time and energy to my IAs and my extended essay, which meant that my grades dropped. So my last few grades in chemistry and biology and maths was okay, but chemistry and biology, my last few grades before going on study leave in March of Terminal were like 4s and 5s. It was really not great, especially considering my offer required 766 in my HLs, so I knew I was way behind schedule. Also, people think that I was studying very hard during my study leave. I was studying hard, but I was extremely inefficient. I'd be in the library from 10 to 6, and I think I would only have maybe 2 to 3 hours of focused work per day because I was just so worn out. What saved me, though, the reason why I managed to slip through, despite all of this being a disaster, is that once I realized what the kind of IAs were asking, and I just did the bare minimum, and honestly the bare minimum is good enough for you to get through with your IAs. And then secondly, I had very, very strong fundamentals specifically in chemistry. Chemistry is one of those subjects that if you don't have extremely, extremely strong bases, it's impossible to go forward because just nothing makes any sense if you don't understand the underlying kind of principles. So when it came to revision, even though I was only really actively working for 3 hours a day in those few weeks, I had these strong bases that I could add on to and build from there. And it got me through. I ended up with 7 in all of my HLs. So.
But first, you thought you weren't going to meet the predicted grades because that's what Oxford was looking at mid-November, like you said, at this time of the year.
Okay, so there are 2 things. One is the admission requirements. And so the admission requirements is what Oxford asks you to have, which is, I think for me, it was a 39 out of 45 with 766 at HL, which is still quite high. And the other thing is predicted grades. And so the predicted grades are what, I think it's Mr. Bunch who kind of issues them based on a mix of your bulletins, speaking to your teachers, knowing you a little bit, I guess. And so he kind of adjusts that and oversells a little bit what he thinks you'll end up getting. Because I was just saying I had strong grades at the end of première and at the beginning of terminale, he was able to predict me quite high without it seeming like a completely huge leap of faith. And so that is what Oxford saw, because that's what's submitted into UCAS, and so that's what Oxford saw. That's why they, invited me to interview. And once I got my offer, essentially what I had to do was meet their academic requirements. And it wasn't clear whether I was going to meet my academic requirements or not because everything was falling apart IB-wise. And so I had to work quite hard in the end of terminale and leading up to exams to make up for that. And so I was really hanging on until the very, very last minute to find out whether I'd make the offer or not. I found out on results day whether I made it or not. It was quite stressful.
So like you said, you talked about the IB for you to in order to get the IB diploma, you had to do the IA, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you were behind on, but you also had to have the predicted grades to meet them in order to get into Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a grade for the IA, like out of 7, just like other subjects?
So I
you
think
just
you're
had to
talking
do
about
it.
the EE. The EE is
EE,
it's fine.
extended essay.
The EE is essentially you've got 2 subjects that you do kind of as a separate from all your other subjects, and those are the extended essay and theory of knowledge, and both of those combined give you a number of points out of 3. I ended up getting 2 points, and essentially it's a grid of if you get an A in your extended essay and a B in TOK, then you get 3 points. I got an A in TOK and then a C in my extended essay and ended up with 2 points essentially. It's not quite graded in the same way as the rest of the subjects.
And does Oxford also look into that?
Oxford doesn't really care as long as you meet your offer, essentially. So for instance, if with your subject grades you got 37 and then you get 2 extra bonus points, then you've met the requirement because their requirement was 39, essentially, if that makes sense.
And the bonus points come from the TOK and the EE.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned a study leave. Could you tell us a little bit more about this? Is this like a year-long leave or just...
No. This is just when... okay.
In high school?
It essentially is when... so we had our exams in May, and basically the whole month of April we were at home for just studying before exams. That's what I meant by
you didn't have
leave.
classes?
Technically speaking, I think I had classes until the 10th of April, but no one really showed up for them.
Okay.
Starting from the beginning of April, because you just know that your time is spent better reviewing for your exams and focusing on what you know you need to improve on, rather than what your teachers think you need to improve on, because your teachers can't cater it individually to every single person.
Oh, that's a great thing to mention about the IB system, how that works in the last years.
Yeah. To be fair, I think it's just EGM who does that. I'm not sure whether it's a really IB thing.
Oh,
it's
it
just
might be the same.
time for you back.
Okay, I'll find out soon enough. And all of this chaos, has it ever made you feel anxious? Would you define yourself as an anxious scholar back in high school? If it's yes, then why? And no, same why?
I think I put myself under a lot of unnecessary stress and pressure, which in turn made me anxious. I don't think it was anxiety with regards to having to interact with teachers or anxiety with having to interact with other classmates. That wasn't really something I had problems with.
Not social, but like academic.
But very much academic. And I think also a lot of it could have been avoided had I been a little bit more strategic in my approach to the IB, I think.
And what advice would you give to your younger self in terms of this, how to be more strategic?
Don't make it overcomplicated. The IB is really not that difficult. For every subject, you've got a subject guide. And I only realized how important these were at the beginning of Terminal. By that point, it's already quite late. Essentially, your subject guide tells you word for word what it is that you need to do and what you need to know in order to succeed. It's giving you a cheat code, essentially. And if you know your subject guide and you know how to approach the exams, then you'll do well, essentially. It's not really it's not rocket science. I mean, in uni it's different, right? At uni they'll tell you, okay, here's this very, very broad syllabus, not entirely clear what you should go into detail in, how much detail you should go into. It's kind of up to you, really, what interests you, what doesn't. Like, there isn't a set kind of, you need to know this, you have to approach the question this way, and if you do this, you'll succeed. That doesn't exist in uni, but in IB, it does, and so you can just take advantage of that instead of kind of wanting to do it your own way.
Okay. And through all of your years at École Emmanuel, who would you say were your favorite teachers?
So there were many teachers, especially in IB, because we spend so much time with them, and we also keep them for 2 years, and many of our classes are a lot smaller than in the French bac. I ended up having excellent kind of rapport with most of my teachers, and I'm very grateful to all of them for both the academic knowledge that they imparted and as well, their support and encouragement throughout those 2 years. I am particularly grateful to Madame Figuier, who was my French literature standard level teacher, and she was very, very consistent in making us practice, and she kind of gave us the IB method very early on, which meant that we could see a very kind of strong improvement. We knew that when we went into the exam room, there was a method and there was a way to do it, and there was a way to do it right. And because we were training in that, essentially from the very beginnings of première, doing many practice essays and all this, it meant that when it was actually time for the exam, we were ready. And then another teacher I want to mention is Mr. Osler. So Mr. Osler, I know many people have got mixed feelings about him because he has a tendency to essentially leave you into the wild and let you figure it out. Which some people say, oh, he doesn't give homework. He like never really he doesn't make you care about the subject. And I think that kind of taught me to care about the subject on my own. And Ms. Dawson was kind of quite clear. My job is not to make you care about the subject. It's up to you. If you want to do well, you have to care. But if you ask me for help, if you want resources, then I'm there for you. And in fact, if Ms. Dawson was one of those people, you send him an email about any question you have in chemistry, and he'll reply. He'll send you, links to websites, PDFs, videos to watch, whatever you want. And that was, A, made me more interested in chemistry, and B, kind of helped me approach learning in a different way, I think.
To go seek it, knowledge by yourself.
Yeah.
And be more curious.
Yeah.
And because you had these different perspectives and experiences, I mean, you had your gap years, in which you had the chance to work, go into the professional world, and now you're at university. You've had your fair share of experience, and I wanted to ask you what advantages you have gained through your education at École Biomedical, and how it has impacted your life now.
Okay, so École Biomedical has got a very, very high standard of education. That's something that we don't necessarily realize. You see that in the way that teachers, I mean, obviously that's not the same for every single teacher, but the teachers engage with students a lot more than in many other schools around the world. If you ask your teachers for help, most likely than not, you will get the help. And I think I always kind of took that for granted, but then you kind of move on through life and you realize not everyone had that. Not everyone would be able to speak to their teachers if and when was necessary, if they needed extra resources, extra help, whatever. Another thing, which is kind of more specific, was the way that EGM drills the scientific method into you so strongly. From the time you're in sixième, you know what a hypothesis is, how you reach a conclusion, the importance of data, how to read it, how to present it. That's something which I particularly realized when I was interviewing here at Oxford. Essentially, there are many kind of data-based questions just to see how you approach experimental setups, and being able to read graphs very easily, very quickly, being able to interpret data. That's something that you don't realize is an advantage until you get here. You're like, oh, this is actually quite simple for me because I know what to look for. I know what the method is, what are those small things I need to watch out for. How do I not get fooled by the way the data is presented, essentially. What else? I do also think that the fact that it's a bilingual education, I mean, it sounds a bit, cliche, but international understanding through bilingual education is a thing. Being able to kind of speak to people who come from different parts around the world and consider different perspectives, even for instance, just on the political scale, right? There are people who are all over the political scale at EGM in a way that's not necessarily going to be as visible as in other places. It might not be the same. You might not have the same breadth of kind of points of view, and I thought that was particularly enriching.
And like we mentioned, since you have an unusual profile because of the young age when you applied to Oxford, what were some considerations you took into account when you prepared your application?
So I was going to graduate at 16, which is quite young. So I already knew I was going to take a gap year. That meant I was going to have to apply for deferred entry, which is essentially you are applying for a place not right after. You apply for places in Terminal, and you're asking for a place not in the year right after that. You're applying for one extra full year later. And what you're doing is you're going up against, you're submitting your application, telling the tutors, look, I know you haven't seen the rest of my competition yet. You haven't seen all the other people who are going to be applying next year, who could potentially be better than me, but I'm asking you to guarantee me a place anyways. And so that means that your application has to be very, very strong. And so that's why I had to place a lot of attention on small details and really, really be focused in my application. And yeah, another thing was the fact that it's all a little bit murky when you're underage. Obviously, like so it's not necessarily underage, but when you're applying for deferred entry, when you're that young, it's not clear how the tutors will perceive it, how it might impact your application. In reality, it doesn't really change that much. Just be aware that your tutors do know your date of birth, which means that they could be a little bit biased. I'm not. It doesn't really. You can't really change that, but it's just something to be aware of.
But they could also be even more impressed because of your precociousness and how young you are and your achievements at such a young age.
True, but they could also say you are quite young. You might completely change your mind. You might go on a gap year and decide that actually astrophysics is what interests you, and that you were only interested in biomed because something about the pandemic caught your fancy and you might not follow that track. So it goes both ways, doesn't it?
It does, definitely. But it's important to consider also these little factors, like you said.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how there was this risk of when you were a deferred student, is that how you call
Sure.
them? There was this risk of, maybe having less chances of getting in because they were, betting on you, like you said, like you mentioned. So why did you only apply to Oxford? And yeah.
So I only applied to Oxford because I knew that if I didn't get in, I could always reapply to other schools during my gap year. That kind of was a very lucky thing because I had 2 shots essentially. Luckily, I didn't need my second shot, which meant that I was tranquille for my gap year. I didn't have to worry about uni that much. I did, technically speaking, apply to Parcoursup, but that was kind of like in the middle of my exam period. I kind of did it just because, and also because as an IB student, you really don't, your grades and the way they are compared to the French grades is entirely unclear. It's kind of a big black box. You enter your grades, you end up with a ranking in some liste d'attente somewhere. You're not really sure how or why that happened. I didn't even apply to any prépas. I think I applied to like licence en sciences de la vie, that kind of thing. And again, yeah, I just knew that if I didn't make it in my first year, I would apply the second year. And
Yeah, that wouldn't be a problem. You just do it next year.
okay.
Perfect. And so Oxford, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why not Cambridge? Because you can only choose one.
You can only choose one, yes. So I think the kind of basic reason was that Cambridge doesn't offer specific courses in sciences. They offer a course called Natural Sciences, or NatSci. And essentially what that is that in the first year you kind of have a broad overview. You can choose modules, but you might have, even if you have an interest in neuroscience, if you also have an interest in physics, you could take a module in physics, for instance, and you specialize later on. Whereas I already knew what specifically I wanted to be studying. I really knew I wanted to be studying biomedical sciences, and I didn't have any interest in studying any extra astrophysics in my first year or any other plant biology type things. So the faster specialization meant that I can essentially learn more about my topic because in the same amount of time, I'm not wasting it on, physics or other subjects.
You already knew what you wanted to do.
Yeah, there's also the fact that Oxford kind of was a long time dream, and so it meant that Cambridge, I did consider Cambridge fairly and equally, but it wasn't considered very, very long.
And where was this dream born, if you don't mind saying about Oxford? I mean, it can seem like a évidence, but
I think it's a number of things. I essentially was, again, we kind of talked about academic pressure, right? And the fact that you can, especially as a child, I was quite ambitious, I think. It was a very kind of simplistic view, was if I'm going to study a subject, I'm going to study it in the best university in the world. And that was Oxford, essentially. For my subject, it remains Oxford. I came to Oxford also 5 years ago and visited, and it didn't help at all because it was just Harry Potter in real life, and so that kind of encouraged that as well. But yeah, I think it was a mix of both of those things.
And you mentioned how you, for a long time, knew you wanted to do biomedical sciences, and how it was partly also related to, the pandemic that we have lived. Was there something or somewhat that really inspired you to study biomedical sciences?
I wouldn't say that there was any particular person who inspired me to study biomed. I think really the reason why biomed was particularly attractive was because I've always been very STEM oriented, and I think humanities and STEM kind of differ in a very important aspect. Humanities is more of an exploration or a journey, whereas STEM is kind of this quest or pursuit of a very kind of specific goal, which is knowledge and understanding, rather than a kind of analysis of how or why. I mean, science asks like what specifically caused what. It's a very logical approach, and so for me, understanding of the world. How can you begin to start thinking about understanding the rest of the universe if you can't even understand what happens in your own body? It's really bringing that scientific understanding to the closest possible thing to you, which is your body, and this is what you use to experience the world outside. So, and pandemic reinforced that, obviously.
I also noticed that on the website, I might be wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you do 3 years of the bachelor that you're doing, so biomedical sciences, it's a Bachelor of Arts? Or no?
Okay, so technically speaking, every single 3-year degree at Oxford gives you a Bachelor of Arts. It's the BA Oxon. Historically, I'm not sure why that's the case. And essentially, if you 7 years after you've graduated, you can upgrade that to a Master of Arts, even though you haven't done any extra studying. It's a bit of a bizarre kind of tradition. But yeah, I mean, what the degree that I'm doing, if you do 3 years, essentially you get a Bachelor of Arts in Biomedical Sciences, and then if you do 4 years, you end up with a Master of Biomedical Sciences in Biomedical Sciences, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's the official name of the degree.
If you do 4 years, you get the master's also?
Yeah, I'm doing a 4-year degree. It's an integrated master's essentially. The way the university presents it to you.
3-year bachelor, 1-year master.
Yeah, the way the university presents it to you, that's slightly different. They say it's a 4-year degree, it's a master's, but you can drop out and have a 3-year degree bachelor's instead. So they really do encourage you to do the 4th year. You have the option in reality.
I just thought it was interesting, the differentiation between the Bachelor of Arts and Science, which I imagine is, like you said, the scientific method and emphasis on, scientific research, all of this work. Because in the UK, you can, maybe in other countries too, you can even do like philosophy, and it's a Bachelor of Science. If there's like, well, maybe not philosophy.
I think it's just really a historic type of thing. I mean, Oxford is really quite old. It's nearly 1,000 years old. I mean,
there are traditions.
There are traditions.
The system. All right. So for the biomedical sciences, for your application, you had to do the BMAT, which is an exam that you can only take once, and that you took in our school. Could you tell us a little bit about how you prepared for it, maybe how the test went for you?
So the BMAT, the test itself went terribly for the very simple reason that the system crashed. Essentially, the timer was still running, but the questions were not loading. It was a bit of a disaster. So in the end, they didn't even consider that as part of the application process because essentially the results were so messed up for the entire country. I think it was the entire world, in fact. The BMAT itself is structured in 3 sections. There's section 1, which is logical reasoning. Section 2, which is kind of scientific knowledge and your standard kind of like biology questions, chemistry questions, whatever. And then section 3 is an essay that you have to write. Oxford weights the first 2 sections 40% each, and the third section, I think, only 20%. There's a syllabus that's online, which essentially just tells you like what you need to know for each subject. I started going through that, I think, in May of première, for the simple reason that essentially it's based on the A-level syllabus. And A-level, because they only do 3 subjects, they go in slightly more depth than the IB does. And so I had to make sure that I covered anything that A-level students might have covered, but that I wouldn't cover in school. And also because it's got chemistry, maths, physics, and biology, and I hadn't done physics in a while, so I had to catch up on physics as well. So that's why I started quite early. In reality, I only started actively preparing for it more seriously over the summer, doing practice tests.
And what did you do for physics? Did you take maybe an additional course online, or just with the practice tests or textbook?
I had an old physics textbook lying around, a GCSE level physics textbook, and so I just used that.
Okay. And was it stressful that you knew you only had one chance before you knew that it was just not going to be even included in the application?
No, I mean, I think I regarded it as the rest of the application. Your personal statement, you only have one chance. I mean, that doesn't really matter. I mean.
And there's also interviews at Oxford. Could you tell us a little bit about how that worked, how that went for you, maybe the questions that you were asked, how it works? Like there's 2 rounds?
Yes and no. So it's not really 2 rounds. What happens is that, okay, so I sat for BMAT in the beginning of November. By the end of November, you've got your BMAT results. In normal years, they would take that into account. Fast, they didn't. And then I think it's about 1 week after BMAT results come out, so it's first week of December, you get emailed about whether you get called for interview or not. If you get called for interview, every subject does it differently. For biomed, what happens is that you are interviewed at your college of choice, because we haven't mentioned it, but you apply to a specific college. You are interviewed at your college of choice, and then you are randomly allocated another college that will also interview you. It's not really 2 rounds. Essentially, it's just 2 sets of interviews that happen within 48 hours of each other, and you complete them. And once they are completed, they will look at the results and how they graded you, put that into a system, and depending on how high your grade was, you get offered a place or not, essentially. And the questions, what were the questions like? This was a while ago. The first interview was, I was given a scientific paper to read through. I had to essentially answer questions on that. They really quite, the nice thing about it is that they really push you to think differently. It's kind of like a mock tutorial. Tutorials are what our classes here at Oxford, they're a bit specific. And then there was an experimental setup that I was kind of asked to evaluate. I think there was drug A and drug B on a diagram, and I had to hypothesize what drug A and drug B might be. In my first interview, I got no questions on my personal statement, but I was asked what I was planning to do on my gap year, and I just said I would keep up my medical interests. Kept it nice and vague. And then they asked me why biomedical sciences and why Oxford. And then my second set of interviews, it was two shorter 20-minute interviews, one right after the other. The first round, essentially they picked a very, very random sentence from my personal statement and quizzed me on that. I was not expecting it because obviously in your personal statement, right, you're supposed to kind of sell yourself a little bit. And I think in the very last paragraph, because Oxford doesn't really care about extracurriculars, I only kept, a little bit of extra information about me in the last paragraph. And I said, I'm interested in learning about how the brain switches between 3 languages like seamlessly because I'm trilingual. And my interviewer picked up on that and said, oh, so how does the brain switch between languages? And I was like, oh. So essentially I waffled on for a little bit, ended up hypothesizing something, I can't remember what I even said. Then I was given a very, very easy maths problem about probabilities. I somehow ended up with a probability of 37 out of 25, realized it wasn't possible, told them, I'm really sorry, I think I've messed up. They had to basically help me through it because I was quite flustered at this point. It did not help that for whatever reason, I couldn't see them for the first part of the interview. Their camera was on, but I couldn't see them. So about 10 minutes into the interview, I said, I'm really sorry, I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to be able to see you. Do you mind if I just leave and come back? So it was all quite stressful, that second interview. And the third question was another experimental setup, asked to evaluate it, kind of evaluate the results. The third interview was with oncologists, which was very cool because I'm very interested in cancer. And I was asked, the very first question they asked was, can you confirm your date of birth? Then they asked me something along the lines of, how would you measure the amount of salt a rat consumes in a day? Something very kind of bizarre like that. Then they gave me a cancer experiment. They asked me to evaluate, I think it was 10 to the power of 1/2, and I said somewhere between 10 and 100. Then they asked me to theorize what, and I said 500. Then I realized I said absolute nonsense, said I'm really sorry, I think I meant 50. But yeah, I was a bit flustered. Those were my 3 interviews. There's a wide kind of variety of questions, at least in the way that I've seen it. They seem to put a lot of emphasis on evaluating experimental setups, seeing how you think, pushing you some maths apparently, but yeah, no, that's that.
No, that gives it a nice overview. How would you advise applicants to approach these questions, and maybe how, to approach your answers, for example, even if you're not sure, like you mentioned, is there a way to there was some people advised to kind of enunciate your thinking process in order for them to understand what you're thinking and not just be blank and say, oh, I don't know.
So the interviews, they're not expecting you to know everything. They're just testing to see how you think and whether you are someone who can learn easily. Keep in mind that it's essentially a mock tutorial. Tutorial is what classes we have here at Oxford, and it's these one-on-one or two-on-one classes with an expert in their field, and you do preparatory work for that, and then they'll kind of ask you questions, push you a little bit, ask you to consider different factors so that you can really make sure you've got a solid understanding of the subject. So what matters is that you know how to explore, is that you can think differently, is that you can hypothesize. It doesn't matter if what you say is wrong. 37 out of 25 is definitely a fine example of that. But what kind of matters is that you can realize that you're wrong and kind of correct that, or pick up on if they tell you are you sure about that, then you have to kind of make sure that you're solid about your reasoning. What else do I? Oh, one thing in EJM, you are very lucky because again most of your teachers are quite happy to discuss with you and help. Particularly in IB, I remember I think there were only 5 of us in our chemistry HL class, which meant that we could really have discussions and engage. That's not the same for BFE, obviously, and I think it depends on which year you are in IB. But these small kind of class sizes really encouraged you to engage with the teachers, and that's something that's, again, not in every school, not everyone has that, but it meant that when I went to interview, I was quite comfortable engaging with these experts in their field, despite them having, I don't know how many titles and, years of research. And it meant that despite that, I could still kind of say what I thought and feel legitimate in what I was saying.
And you mentioned how it's also graded. Do you know, like, kind of the criteria in the interview, or it's kind of like left
I think so you can request your feedback from your application after you got your offer, you didn't get your offer. I think it's just in case you want to reapply, you can kind of figure out like where you went wrong, where you didn't go wrong. I ended up the scores for biomed are you are graded between 1 and 5 on each college grades you from 1 to 5, so I had 2 grades from 1 to 5. It's just kind of, it's very vague descriptors, like 1 is very poor and then 5 is outstanding, I think. And then they add those two together. If you've got a higher number, then you've got a higher chance of getting in. And that's what I mean by I think there's a common misconception that if you apply to certain colleges, it's easier to get in. It's wrong. Your application is evaluated by the department. All of these interview scores kind of go and are added and are processed centrally by the department. If you've got a high score, then you get in. It doesn't matter. Even if you don't get into your college of choice, another college will take you in.
So you advocate for not going, choosing the open application and choosing a college that you really like. So I guess you really like UNIV College, where you're at here. Why is that? Was there any particular reason that you prefer this one over others?
Okay, so yeah, the open application, essentially you're losing your chance to say, I definitely don't want this college. Even if you don't know which particular college you would prefer, there are going to be some colleges which are going to be objectively nicer for you to be at than others. If you prefer to be in the center of town and you end up in a college that's really, really far, then you're in trouble. And if you just say open application, well, you're just going to end up being put where other people didn't get put, essentially. And so you're losing out on that chance. I really liked UNIV because essentially it was always described as being sociable and friendly. It's also very central, which makes life easy. It's big. I didn't want to be in like a tiny, tiny college in which everyone knows everyone's business. It's quite pretty. It's not the grandest college, but that's why it feels still like quite homey, but it doesn't feel like a concrete block, which some colleges are. I think the sociable and very friendly aspect was what attracted me to UNIV specifically.
Did you find out about UNIV College through maybe a friend, or did you do research on this to kind of get a grasp of how it was like to live here?
I think actually this is a terrible source, but actually it's not that bad. There was this one guy who had a YouTube channel who was just like vlogging his life in Oxford, and he was at UNIV, and so his life at UNIV seemed great, and so I said, you know what, this seems like a fair enough source. And then the rest of the internet, like there's a student room which has got a kind of guide to the colleges, like pros and cons for each one. And again, you kind of like look at UNIV, and it doesn't really have a reputation of being particularly, being particularly politically inclined or not. I mean, I know that some colleges have a very strong political culture, and I just didn't really want to be around that. So this was the right choice for me.
Okay. And to go back to the requirements that you had to meet for the admission process, so before the interview, there's the personal statement, and I imagine you didn't apply through UCAS because you only applied to Oxford in the UK.
I did apply through UCAS,
but only had one choice out of the 5. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So you did the personal statement, and I was wondering if you have some advice to offer to students when choosing a topic or a style for their writing. Are there any specific aspects that they should highlight? Maybe you can give an example of what you wrote about.
Okay, so here's one thing which I think is kind of important, is that if you read personal statements from other people who have also applied for your subject, you are not going to be able to unsee them, and you're going to kind of really struggle writing a personal statement that sounds like it's yours. So what I did was I read personal statements from people who got in, but for completely different subjects. I read one in like classics, archaeology, anthropology and archaeology, something like that. Modern languages, because it gives you an idea of how do you make your personal statement sound academic, what kind of things do you mention, without kind of having that template feeling to your personal statement. My tip would also be just word vomit whatever you want on your first draft. Your first draft doesn't matter, and then you can kind of rework it, give it to someone to read over, ask for feedback on it from your friends. Don't ask for feedback from like people who are academics, because then they might have a tendency to rework it a little bit too much, and so it doesn't really sound like you anymore. In terms of what you write, if you did IB and your extended essay relates to your subject, definitely write about that. I know that in A levels they've got a thing called EPQ, EQP, I don't know, some sort of like extended project type thing, which is similar to our extended essay. Because you've gone in such detail into a specific subject, you can talk about that at length. I also had read a book by, it doesn't matter, it was a book about cancer. I really liked it. I put that in there. There was also, I also think that for preparing, people kind of think, like, oh, you have to take courses and all this. You can't, I mean, it's true, you can take courses if you want. I ended up basically watching a series of lectures on Coursera. I don't know if you are familiar, it's like the online free learning platform. It was just a series of lectures on physiology. I think there were maybe 10 or 12 of them, 1 hour long each. You just put them on instead of watching Netflix, you watch physiology lecture. You don't have to take notes on it, you don't have to care. Some of the knowledge will kind of infiltrate your brain somehow. And it didn't really feel like work, because if you love the subject, then it doesn't feel like work. It just kind of, you do enjoy learning about it. And so that should kind of transpire when you're writing a personal statement, I think.
And back in high school, I was wondering if you did competitions or Olympiads that are more academically maybe oriented, since you said that the UK has an emphasis on academics rather than extracurriculars.
The answer is no. I did absolutely none of that. I think there's this misconception that if you want to apply to top institutions, you have to be, like chemistry Olympiad champion, like you have to do brain bee, you have to do all these things. To be fair, I also think it was easier for us because COVID happened, which meant that essentially a lot of these things were cancelled. We didn't have to worry about internships because we just knew that there were not going to be any internships happening. So we weren't thinking of, oh, do other applicants have internships? Do I have to do internships? I just don't. I mean, there are many other people who also will say, like, internships don't really matter that much. They are helpful if you gain something from them and you learn from them. But again, if you just demonstrate a strong interest in your subject, then that should transpire in your personal statement. You don't need an internship or a specific competition or research to go and consolidate that.
And you're also very passionate about ballet that you've been doing for a lot of years in your childhood. For how long have you been doing this, and what inspires you in ballet?
Misconception. I did ballet between the ages of like 3 and 8, essentially, and then I stopped. I started again 3 years ago, so when I was nearly 15 at that point, which basically meant that I was starting over pretty much from scratch at that. It really was. I ended up in a class where everyone had been dancing for 10 years and I had not, and I was a very, very basically a beginner. So I haven't been doing that for that many years. What I love about it is why I've always loved classical music, so that, and also I had danced before, so I had already an attachment to ballet in general. But more interestingly, the reason why I really grew to love it so much was because I wasn't competing against anyone. The fact that I ended up in a class in which everyone had such a higher level compared to me meant that I wasn't trying to be better than them, because I knew that I wouldn't be, and I could just accept that there was nothing wrong with being the worst one in the room, and that it just meant that I could appreciate it for what it was, essentially, rather than how good I was at it, if that makes sense. And I feel that's a mindset that people should kind of try and adopt more when they're approaching new things, because that's when you really find enjoyment in new things.
And are you planning to continue it here in university? How would you advise students to kind of like balance your studies at such a rigorous and hard university, and maybe your career even, with your hobby and passion?
I do continue ballet. I take ballet classes. I think hobbies are super important to kind of schedule into your weekly kind of plan. Obviously, you have to be careful to not sign up to too many things, but I do feel like sports specifically are one of those things which are so important in uni life. It's so easy to get caught up in, your studies, going out, your social life, that you kind of forget to take care of your body as well. Obviously, there's nutrition as well, but that's a whole separate topic. But sports forces you to go outside, you meet new people, and you try something new. So this year I've signed up for ballet. I train with a ski team as well, and I row, which means that I have quite the busy schedule. I go for runs from time to time with the kind of social running group as well, which means that I really am kept in shape. But I think it's super important to maintain your hobbies, and specifically sports hobbies, because they give you a break from your workload. They keep you in, mens sana in corpore sana, I think is the Latin saying. Healthy mind and a healthy body, if I'm not wrong. You can't really function if you're not healthy physically.
And I can imagine your schedule here allows you to have this work-life balance, like that you're talking about. For example, could you give us an idea of how many hours of lectures you have and how many hours of independent work you have to do? Um,
I have one of the notoriously heavy workloads in the university. It's like biomed is one of those subjects that if you tell people you do biomed, they say, "Oh, you're gonna suffer." Um, Biomed, we've got maybe 20 hours of lectures per week. That includes practical work as well, so we've got practicals every week. And then on top of that, we have got, I'd say, 3 tutorials every 2 weeks. A tutorial is only 1 hour long, but you have to prepare for that with, essentially your tutors will give you a list of kind of questions to consider, maybe they might give you calculations, and then they will give you your essay, and your essay could be on a topic that you've never heard of before. And so all the research that you'll be doing, um, it takes up a huge amount of time. So for one tutorial, you could end up spending up to 12 hours preparing, which is really quite a lot. So if you think, okay, you've got, say, 18 hours a week of tutorial work, plus your 20 hours of lectures, that's already 38 hours. You also have to review your lectures because you need to review your lectures. There's not really much, way around that. So add another, say, 10 hours of work. So that gives you 50 hours if you're being diligent. If you're not being diligent, I'm sure you could probably scrape by with, squeezing it into 40, but it's still quite intense. Yeah.
that gives it a nice idea of what it's like to study here. And for example, can you also tell us about the courses that you're taking? I know it's biomedical science, but there's other maybe modules in it, classes.
So biomed is in first year essentially. You've got basically call it a tronc commun if you want. You've got 4 kind of main subjects, which is body and cells, brain and behavior, genes and molecules, and then numerical skills. Numerical skills got like some chemistry, some physics, some mathematical modeling, and some stats work, which includes a lot of coding, which I was not aware of, but you get what you get. And those 4 subjects you have to take in first year. Everyone takes them. It's mandatory. And then in second year, you kind of get to choose options. And by third year, you choose to specialize either in neuroscience or in cells and systems biology. That means that your Bachelor in Arts will be in biomedical sciences in neuroscience or in cells and systems biology. And that means that you can really tailor your course to study whatever you really want, starting from second year, which is really cool because it gives you a lot of freedom to study what you enjoy and get rid of the things you don't enjoy.
And overall, to kind of end the topic of Oxford, what do you think made you stand out the most on your application?
What made me stand out the most? I think, okay, so what happened, I was discussing this with tutors recently, actually. They were saying that when you apply and when they see your personal statement and when they see your test results, at the end of the day, everyone's got great test results. Your personal statement, it tells you a little bit about you, but it doesn't tell you that much. There aren't 800 ways of writing a personal statement. It's just going to be you saying, I like this particular side of biomed because XYZ. What really makes you stand out is the interview. And essentially, if you do well on your interview, your tutors will have a good impression of you. They'll have, and I mean, keep in mind, just your tutors are people, I'm taught by the same people who interviewed me. They pick and choose who they want to teach, essentially. So if you come off as someone who's curious, who's willing to learn, who really loves the subject, that's what they'll kind of take away from that. And then they're the people who will kind of give you the grade that will go into your ranking to the department, and then the department will see if you get a place or not. But yeah, the interview is definitely the defining factor.
And is there a way to prepare for it? Did you maybe practice? Did a mock interview?
I did a few mock interviews with alumni, so alumni who had gone through the process. And essentially that meant that I had a pretty good idea of what it was going to feel like. I recommend doing maybe 1 or 2 or 3, depending on how much time you have, to get comfortable with being pushed past your comfort zone by tutors. I also think it's one of those things that there obviously is a method to prepare, but you're not going to go into that interview being fully prepared ever, because there is no way to be fully prepared. You just have to go in with curiosity and a willingness to learn.
And so to talk about your gap year, which was before this year in Oxford, You have interned at Serba Research and Sofinova Partners. Could you tell us a little bit about these companies and your experience there?
Serba Research and Sofinova Partners. So Serba Research is a contract research organization, which means essentially that pharma companies will outsource clinical trials management to them. So if they've got a new drug, they want to test it, they'll outsource that work to Serba. It was really interesting. I really got to understand a lot more about the pipeline, the process of how these things kind of get organized. I got to visit a testing center as well. My work there essentially was creating presentations and translating things a lot because I don't really have that many skills in research because I am a child. What that meant was I just basically got a really good overview of clinical trials, which is a very kind of specific branch of the medical field, and it's important if you want to go into research. Sofinova Partners is a life sciences venture capital firm based in France. I was responsible for scouting, which essentially means that I was looking. Oh, if you're not familiar with venture capital, it just means that you're investing in startups and small companies that you hope will grow, and if they grow and kind of lead the market, then you will make a lot of money, is essentially the concept. So what you want to be doing is scouting for projects which could have this kind of potential, like wow factor, this special thing that will make them grow and kind of provide a new service to the market. And so scouting just basically meant that I was going through many patents and reading through a lot of scientific kind of articles and literature. The really nice thing about Sofinova is that everyone there is really passionate about the science, which I really appreciated. Everyone in my office was a PhD or some sort of senior researcher before they moved into finance, which is really cool. I had, obviously, if you're more senior, then you do the actual financial managing kind of bit. I didn't really get to do that because I'm not senior, but I really do think it was a helpful experience, yeah.
And it might have given you an idea of what you want to do later in the professional world after university. Do you know what your dream job is?
I think that, well, I do have some time, but I think that what's super clear is that I really want to stay in the biomedical field. It is a fantastic field. There's always innovation. It will not be replaced by AI, which is a good consideration. The question is, do I do some research before I move into corporate? Because I think I will eventually move into corporate. I think I'm thinking consulting and then probably asset management. So asset management could be venture capital, which is what I just spoke of, and I really enjoyed that. I really could see myself there. Or PE, so private equity. That's kind of managing companies which are already established. Or I could go into pharma. Who knows? We'll see. I mean, that's the nice thing about the field is that it's big. There are many opportunities, and I have got plenty of time.
Absolutely, definitely.
Yeah.
Do you have a piece of advice for graduating students of École Génie Manuel who are embarking on this new journey? It can be about academics, university, or just life in general.
I think that one super important thing to consider is learn how to spend time alone. Because when you learn to spend time alone and you kind of learn to take a step back, it's something I was basically forced to do on my gap year. It means that you really kind of reevaluate what are the things that are important to you, and you ensure that you kind of make decisions because they are what you want rather than what, I don't know, the crowd wants or what your friends want. I also do think that, especially when you're moving to a new country, or if you're moving to a new city, many people will end up graduating from uni and then move to like the next big city, and it's easy to kind of get caught up in your job and have difficulty kind of making new friends. That's the thing that many adults will tell you. And if you are not familiar with spending time on your own, then you will struggle, I think, to kind of get used to that and appreciate your own company. And a sort of like larger subset of that is just generally take care of your health, particularly your mental health, really, which, I mean, obviously, both your mental health and your physical health. Your physical health, I mean, eat well, stay hydrated, exercise, and then your mental health can be anything from keep up with your hobbies, make good friends who you can count on. That's really very basic life advice. I'm sorry I don't have anything more original, but I feel like it's worth reminding.
Would you say you are successful when you have all of these components in your life?
What's success?
A very good question. I might ask you, what is success to you, Isadora?
Yeah, no, I saw that question. I honestly don't really have a very kind of strong answer. I think success is just continuing to having the opportunity to continue to do what you love. It doesn't mean that you have to achieve it. It doesn't mean that you have to excel at it. It doesn't mean that you have to be the top person. You know, I continue to do ballet. That's success to me. I'm not going to become a prima ballerina ever. But it doesn't matter because my idea of success is just continuing to do the things that I love. So if you have, to answer the kind of previous question, if your physical health and your mental health are solid and are in a good place, then you will be better equipped to continue to do the things that you enjoy, and then I suppose you could say that you are successful.
And thank you very much, Isadora. This is great. Perfect.
Thank you, Victoria.
It's great. I was like, no, this is weird, but like, what do you love? But I guess you love ballet.
What do
you
I love?
You
I mean,
love
to be fair, what do I love? I love my course. I love my degree. I really, really, really enjoy that. I love the people I surround myself with, whether that be friends or family. And I love music, art, and beautiful things.
That's a beautiful answer. And is there a book that you particularly love?
A book? Well, the cancer book that I mentioned about my personal statement, I've got to say that was a fantastic, fantastic book. It's called The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and it's the subtitle is A Biography of Cancer, and that's exactly how it reads. It reads like a story of cancer. You really feel like you're watching it kind of evolve. It's about the history of, when it first originated, the history of treatment, how people approached it. It doesn't really feel like you're reading anything sciencey because it's written in such a fantastic way. It really flows. It won the Pulitzer Prize recently. Strongly recommend. It's a fat book, but it's a good one.
Well, I love talking to you, Isadora. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
doing
Victoria.
this interview, and congratulations on getting into Oxford.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for tuning in on this episode of the Anxious Scholar podcast. See you in 2 weeks for the next interview, and don't miss out on any additional information on our Instagram @The Anxious Scholar.